Good morning, everybody. We're going over our last chapter of this class, chapter 22. So the good news is I think it's quite a bit easier than the last couple of chapters that we've been doing. There's only one new graph to learn, and it's all based on the ASAD model, which you guys probably are starting to understand a little bit better. So basically everything comes from the ASAD model in lecture today. Let's do a quick review of the ASAD model just so we remember, because we're going to be using it a lot today. What goes on the y-axis in the ASAD model? Who remembers? The price level, the overall price level, right? And what goes on the x-axis? The quantity of all the goods sold. And so in one country, the quantity of all the goods sold in an entire year is also known as the GDP, right, the output. So we're going to go ahead and put real GDP on this axis. Okay, so then we have an AD curve, and the AD curve slopes downwards because it's composed of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, right? And so anytime the price goes up, we buy less of those things. Basically, is kind of the short version of it. Now, there is a short-run aggregate supply curve that slopes upwards, right? And then, of course, there's the long-run aggregate supply, which is straight up and down, okay? And so we always end up coming back to the place where the long-run aggregate supply is. We'll call that the natural rate of production or of output. And the aggregate demand curve represents consumers, people who buy things, right? The short-run both of the aggregate supply curves represent suppliers, people who make things. Last chapter, we talked about how the government can get involved to prevent depressions or recessions in the short run, right? For example, we know that if the AD curve falls to here, because, I don't know, for some reason people get poor, and now we're at AD prime, you see we're going to be at a lower level of output than YN. On its own, in the long run, right, we know that stuff comes back to normal. In this case, what would happen? Well, since we now have a lower price, since this is our P prime, our old price used to be up here, right? Our old price used to be up here. Firms start expecting lower price level, right? So low levels of inflation or even deflation. And so what they do is they make their SRAS curve come forward to here because they're like, oh, the prices are going to be less in the future. So that means I can pay my workers less in the future. So my costs are not quite as bad. So in the future, I'm going to go ahead and supply more, right? And so that's how the society would naturally come back all by itself to the natural rate of unemployment, or natural rate of output, sorry.
In this example, you don't expect natural rate of output, would the wages be lower for people?
The question is, would the wages be lower for people when it comes back to the natural rate? Absolutely. But that's a nominal wage, and so it doesn't actually matter because the wages for everyone is lower. But look, the price level is lower also. So this is P double prime now, right? So yes, I'm getting paid less, but the goods I'm purchasing are less also. So I actually have the same real wage as before. My real wage never changed. Okay, so in the long run, stuff comes back to equilibrium all by itself. However, let's suppose that we're Keynesian all of a sudden, and we're like, I'm not going to wait for the long run. I'm not going to wait for it to fix itself, right? What would a Keynesian say that the government should do? Well, exactly. So the Keynesian idea here is that in the long run, we're all dead, right? And I can use government policies to push this AD curve back up, right? There's two policies. There's fiscal policy and there's monetary policy, right? Monetary policy has to do with the Federal Reserve, and what they do is they pump money into the economy. Remember, that's the same thing as buying bonds. They buy bonds from the banks, give the banks money, right? And what that does is it puts more money in the circulation. It increases the AD curve, specifically investment, right? When there's more money out there, people can take more loans, firms can build more factories, and it pushes the AD curve back up to where it used to be, right? The other option is fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the United States government or any state or local governments. What they do is they start spending more money to build more things, roads, bridges, schools, whatever it is that they build. And because government spending goes up, that's going to push the AD curve back up, right? And it'll push the price level back up. And more importantly, it will bring us back to the natural rate of output, okay? At the natural rate of output, we also are at the natural rate of unemployment, because it's basically the flip side of the same coin, right? This many people are working, making this stuff, and then the people who aren't working are unemployed. So as as Y drops, right? That means we're making less stuff when AD curve falls, right? We're making less stuff. What happens to unemployment? It goes up, right? So it's exactly opposite. So whenever you think of real output, you should also think of it being the opposite of unemployment, okay? So as real output falls, because AD curve is falling in this case, we're making less things, fewer things, and so more people are unemployed because there's fewer companies that are making things, right? So that's kind of the idea. Okay, so the idea here is that when fiscal and monetary policy is enacted by the government and the Fed to push the AD curve back up, it pushes the Y back up to YN, and it also reduces the unemployment, right? When I have more, when my Y increases, I reduce unemployment, right? Because my firms are expanding and they're making more stuff, so they hire more people, so unemployment goes down, okay? So you very much see that just by moving the AD curve, there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, right? Because if I push the AD curve back up, right? So first of all, imagine that there was some bad problem and the AD curve fell. Prices fall, and then output falls, okay? But then in order to put it back up to where it should be, I don't know, the government uses one of these to push the AD curve back up, right? So what does that mean? Prices go up, that's inflation, and output goes up, meaning unemployment goes down, okay? So there's this just really basic idea already that you guys already know, that if I make prices go up by pushing the AD curve up, if I make inflation go up, I can make unemployment go down. Can you see that? That's all we're going to explore today. It's just this this very simple thing. As long as you understand it's not really that complicated. We're going to talk at length about it. But the idea here is that if I push the AD curve up, hey, unemployment goes down. That's because Y goes up, right? Unemployment goes down. But unfortunately, inflation goes up, right? So what do I want more? Do I want to have fewer people work? Well, that's going to make inflation go up. But if I want inflation to go down, what happens? Unemployment goes up, right? So it's kind of this teeter-totter balance, because you can see it right here from this graph, okay? So that's basically what we're going to talk about today. All right, so we're going to ask how inflation and unemployment are related in the short run. That's the teeter-totter effect. In the long run, what always happens in the long run? We always come back to what? The natural rate of Y. And the natural rate of unemployment too, right? So in the long run, does changing price have anything to do with the unemployment? Not at all. This teeter-totter effect we're talking about is only in the short run, okay? We're going to talk about what sort of things change the relationship. We're going to talk about what's the short-run cost of reducing inflation if inflation gets too high, right? And then we're going to talk about in the 1990s, it's weird, for the first time, we didn't have the teeter-totter effect because inflation went down, and normally we think that unemployment goes up. But in the 1990s, inflation went down and unemployment went down. So they both went down together, okay? We're going to talk about that interesting point in time in the United States, okay? And try to understand, using the ASAD model, why that happened, okay? All right. So in the long run, inflation and unemployment are unrelated, right? We just determined that. If I push the AD curve up and I make prices go up, i.e. I make inflation, it doesn't matter because we're always going to be back at YN, which means we're going to be back at the natural rate of unemployment, right? So why is that? Well, inflation is a what kind of variable? Nominal or real? Nominal, right? Inflation is just the change in prices. Price is for sure nominal, right? That's what the classical people say. Don't forget, the classical people say, in the long run, nominal variable has nothing to do with a real variable like real unemployment and the real number of people unemployed, right? That's what the classical people say. It never has anything to do with each other, right? And so we know this. The inflation rate depends only on growth in what? the money supply. In the long run, I taught you this a couple of chapters ago, right? In the long run, why do prices rise? The government prints money. That's the only reason over time why prices rise, right? Now, if you look at the ASAD curve, you realize, I hope, that let's say that the government uses fiscal policy to push up the AD curve. We know there's going to be a momentary bump in prices. You see that? Right? So you might have short-term inflation from other stuff, like the government building a bridge and pushing the AD curve up. Might make prices go up, right? But over time, in the long run, the way that the money goes up, the prices go up over time, that is always only caused by printing money, growth in the money supply. Okay? Don't forget that. And of course, the unemployment always tends to go back to the natural rate of unemployment. And how do we determine the natural rate of unemployment? Well, it depends on the minimum wage, market power of unions, efficiency wages, and the process of job search. Remember, we call this frictional unemployment. Job search is frictional unemployment. And then this we call structural unemployment. Okay? Structural and frictional unemployment together make the natural rate of unemployment. And that's where unemployment always goes to in the long run. Okay? But in the short run, and we just learned this once we learned the ASAD model, right? You can't explain this chapter, what I'm about to teach you, you cannot explain it without the ASAD model, right? We know that there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. We know there's the teeter-totter effect that I just taught you guys about earlier. Okay? So let's investigate. There's the graph that shows us the teeter-totter effect, the trade-off between unemployment and inflation, is called the Phillips curve. Okay, the Phillips curve. Where did it come from? Well, in 1958, this guy named Phillips, right? He showed that he did some research, and he looked in the United Kingdom, right? And he saw that when wages grew, the nominal wages grew, that unemployment went down. Okay? So basically, what is he saying here? What's nominal wage growth? Well, that's a price, right? Nominal wage growth is just a price. It's how much I'm paying my workers. It's an input price, right? When prices go up, he saw that unemployment went down, right? He's the first person to kind of look at this teeter-totter effect and say, hey, when prices go up, output goes up, so unemployment goes down. He was the first person to see this. Right? It's so easy when we have the ASAD curve and we can just see it like this. It's so easy. But they didn't have they sure didn't have the same sophisticated version of this ASAD curve. Imagine without this, right? You're just looking blindly at your economy and trying to figure out what's going on. It's way difficult, right? So this is the first guy. He starts saying, this price is going up. The price of people's wages is going up. And then unemployment goes down, right? And in 1960, Paul Samuelson, Robert Solow, two very famous economists, okay? They're like, I wonder if that's true in the United States, right? And guess what? It was true in the United States. They found that when United States inflation went up, so instead of just using the price of labor, they used all prices. They're like, well, I want to check at all prices. They saw that when all prices go up, we call that inflation, right? Unemployment went down, okay? And so, of course, they named this effect after this guy. He's the first guy to discover it, Phillips, right? So that's where the name comes from. They call it the Phillips curve. All right. So, yeah, and basically all it says is they found that when the price level was going up, output was going up, which was making unemployment go down, right? So there's a teeter-totter effect. Inflation goes up, unemployment goes down. All right, so let's see what the curve looks like. All right, let's go ahead and draw it on our own. Let's pretend that we are Phillips or that we're Samuelson. I'm not going to teach you what it looks like until we figure out how it should look. Let's suppose that prices equal 100, right? The CPI is 100 this year. The price of the basket of goods is 100. Okay? This is just to suppose. All right. Now, we know that there are two options next year in the ASAD model. Now, there could be 100 different possible options, but all of my models, we just have as simple as possible, right? We could have good state of the world or bad state of the world, okay? So we could have aggregate demand low, meaning, what does that mean when aggregate demand falls like this? some sort of a recession or maybe a stock market crash or something that affects people's buying power, right? Okay. So we could have the bad state of the world, aggregate demand low, right? And so what does that do to price? When aggregate demand falls, what does that mean? Price is low, right? And what does that mean about unemployment? High unemployment, right? Because the GDP fell, right? When GDP falls, that means all the factories are shrinking because they're not making as much, so they're laying off people. So there's high unemployment. So there's the first possible option. AD curve could be low. The other possible option, let's just say, is that the AD curve could be high, right? We can have a super high AD curve. Okay, so yeah, the other possible option, we could have the AD curve be high. Stocks are doing well. People are buying a lot. In this case, what would happen? Prices would be high, right? If the AD curve was up, prices would be high, and unemployment would be really low because GDP would be super high. It means all the factories are working as hard as they can. They're hiring all these people, right? So we have two options according to the ASAD model, right? Okay, so let's do those two options. There's the SRAS curve, short run aggregate supply, and let's do this first one, low aggregate demand. So the AD curve's really low, right? So let's say that I have a low price of 103 and I have a low Y, which means that I'm going to go ahead and plot the Phillips curve. Now the Phillips curve is the teeter-totter between what? Inflation and unemployment rate. So that's what I'm going to put on the axes, right? Inflation and unemployment rate. And I'm going to see how it looks. Okay? So let's say that the price level was 100 and it went up to 103. That's 3% inflation. That's just to make it really simple, right? 3% inflation. Let's say that we have, I just made this number up, 6% unemployment rate. Just a high number. Tried to make up a high number. Okay? Now, what was the other option? We could have the good state of the world where the economy is booming and the ASAD curve is super high, right? So let's draw this guy. Super high AD curve, super high AD curve because the economy is doing well. What does that do to the price? It makes the price high. And what does it do to unemployment? It's going to make it low because output is increasing. Y is high. And when Y is high, that means we're making a bunch of products. That means there's hardly anybody unemployed. So unemployment is low, right? So let's draw that. When the inflation is high, 5%, what's the unemployment rate? It's down low. It's 4%. I just made these numbers up, by the way, okay? Just to show you. Okay? So what does the shape of the Phillips curve look like? Connect those dots, right? What is it going to be?
Downward slope.
Downward sloping, okay? So here's the trade-off, right? I can be anywhere I want on this Phillips curve. I could either have really low inflation, but unfortunately high unemployment, or I could slide back up here, and I'm really low unemployment, but I have high inflation, okay? So Phillips, Samuelson, these guys looked at this, Robert Solow, they looked at this, they're like, oh, well, this is convenient. We can slide anywhere we want along here. And how do we slide along there? We can pump up the AD curve, up or down. We have a choice, right? And so they're like, oh, this is a policy menu, they called it, right? I have a menu, right? Policymakers can choose. And why do I say policymakers can choose? Well, because policymakers ultimately do fiscal or monetary policy. That pumps up the AD curve or pushes it down, and that can help us slide along the Phillips curve. We want high inflation and low unemployment or something like that, right? So people are like, oh, this is nice. We can control the economy exactly. We can have low unemployment with high inflation, right? And we're like, this is our menu. They're at a restaurant. And they're like, I'll take this, please. Low unemployment, high inflation. And, and then they do it, right? They're like, oh, well, I can do the opposite. I can have low uninflation with high unemployment, right? If I want to, just slide along this Phillips curve. Okay? They're like, well, we could have anything in between. We could have medium in unemployment and medium inflation. Okay? And so if you just look at the AD curve and the short-run aggregate supply curve and you forget about the long-run aggregate supply, if you forget about the long run, this totally makes sense, doesn't it? It totally makes sense, okay? But, and in the 1960s, it did, because they were only looking at data for a couple of years. Guess what? Do you think that they looked at long-run data or short-run data? Short-run data, exactly, right? This whole Keynesian idea was pretty new, right? remember, before Keynes came out in the 40s, all anybody ever thought about was kind of the long run thing. And then Keynes came in and he's like, in the long run we're all dead. Let's just do short run, all right? And so, they started developing the ASAD model. This is how we get the short run ideas, right? But it was still really quite new. I don't think that people really knew how to drive this model. Drive is maybe the wrong verb. How to utilize this model, right? So when they were at first looking at this, they missed the LR, long run aggregate supply curve. Okay. This class that you're taking right now did not exist in the 1960s because nobody knew this actually yet. All right, nobody knew it. You guys are the benefit of having 50 years of people looking back and being, oh, this is a mistake we made, right? So right now, today, you guys understand this probably better than these Nobel Prize winning economists did back then, just because this class that I'm teaching you didn't exist back then, because I wouldn't have known it either, right? Okay. So here's what they saw, right? They just plotted. They plotted all the points in the 1960s. 1961, 1962, 1963, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68. That looks like almost a perfect Phillips curve, doesn't it? Right? We have unemployment rate down here. We have inflation rate. And what did remember the theoretical one that we drew a couple slides back? Here, I'll show it to you. The one that we drew, this is our theoretical Phillips curve, right? It slopes downwards, unemployment rate, inflation, right? And so they saw this, and they're like, oh, I'm going to plot all of the points for all the years. Oh my goodness, look at this. Perfect Phillips curve, right? Doesn't that look like a perfect Phillips curve? So they're like, boom. They submitted some papers. They got some Nobel Prizes for this. Everybody was all happy, right? And so they're like, oh, this is great. They went ahead in 1961. They had high unemployment. So what did they say to the Fed? What policy did they say we should take? If you can look at it, right? At the end of here, what's this? 7 years later, we have high inflation, but we have really low unemployment. You guys see that? So they started in 1961 with low unemployment. They're like, oh, but I know the Phillips curve. All I got to do is pump up inflation, and I'll lower unemployment. And it worked for a couple of years. See, this is perfect Phillips curve, right? People are really happy. Let me ask you this question, though. What do you think that people were doing to try to get there? Like, what was the government doing over here?
Spending more.
Exactly. The government was either printing money or spending more. They were pushing up the AD curve, right? Pushing up the AD curve, which was pushing the YN up high, really high, right? But was also pushing the prices up really high. That's what we have right there, okay? So let's go ahead and draw that point on our ASAD model. Well, that's a great question. The question was it being pushed beyond the natural rate? And I'm going to give you a hint because I already know what the rest of the slides look like. Yeah. Okay. So here is the economy in long-run equilibrium, right? Let's suppose in 1961 we had 6 or 7% unemployment, and that was kind of where we should have been. But what did the government do? They said, oh, all I got to do is pump up the AD curve to here. They pumped up the AD curve. P prime. We have Y. So output went up, unemployment went down, prices went up, right? And that's exactly what we have here, right? By the time we get over here, we have low unemployment, we have high inflation, okay? And so it's way up here, okay? Now, these guys didn't realize this, but you guys do already realize something because I've taught you hopefully well. Are we going to stay here? Is the economy going to stay there in the long run? No. What's going to happen? What do we know is going to happen? We're going to go back to the natural rate. How does the economy move to the long run natural rate? Like, what is the next thing that changes? You guys remember? Right, because we got here. We started here, right? And by 1968 we're here. But what happens? How do we move from here back to the long run aggregate supply curve? Who remembers? What curve changes? Short run aggregate supply, right? Why? Well, don't forget that short run aggregate supply incorporates expected inflation, not actual inflation, what we expected, right? So as people see the prices rising over and over again every year, they're going to start expecting what? High inflation, right? So imagine you're a firm and you're like, oh man, every year the price level is going to go up. That means wages are going to go up. That means if I hire some guy in 1 year, I'm going to have to pay him way even more because that's just what's happening, right? So since I'm having to pay my workers so much more each year, the amount of supply that I can supply goes down, right? My supply curve decreases because I have to pay my workers so much, right? So what happens to the short run aggregate supply? It decreases, right? So it moves to the left, it decreases. And guess what? Where do I end up at? Natural rate. But what do you know about the prices?
The rest goes up.
The price goes up even higher, okay? Okay. So you guys should be looking at this and be like, I know we're not going to stay here forever. But don't forget, at this time, nobody knew this, okay? Because this class didn't exist. Everybody thought we were going to stand there, right? So in 1968, they're happy, okay? 1968, it's a little bit of high inflation rate, but the unemployment rate is low. You know what's going to end up happening, right? We're going to go from here to here. So the inflation rate is going to go what? Even higher. And what's going to happen to the unemployment rate? It's going to go up at the same time, right? Because as I go from here to here, right, as I go along here, this is the natural long-run adjustment, right? This has nothing to do with the government. This one was the government. This one is the natural long-run adjustment. Look, prices go up and output goes down. When output goes down, unemployment goes up. Oh man, we're going to have not the teeter-totter effect again, right? We're like on the brink of this cliff where something bad is going to happen. We're going to have prices go up and unemployment go up. They're both going to go up together. About to happen, right? So in this graph, what would it look like? If unemployment went up and inflation went up, that would be like moving this way, right? This is bad zone in this graph, right? Because I got high prices, high inflation, and I got high unemployment. I don't ever want to move in this direction, but I know I'm about to. Look, right? I'm about to go from here to here. This means price went up and inflation went up. Okay, so at any rate, pretend that you didn't know this yet, right? Everyone's looking, hey, look, perfect Phillips curve, downward sloping. Yay, let's give this guy Phillips a Nobel Prize. I don't know, something like that. Well, Milton Friedman and Edmund Phelps came along, all right? And Edmund Phelps actually both these guys got a Nobel Prize in their lives. This guy specifically got a Nobel Prize because he was like, guys, hello, look at the long run, right? So Edmund Phelps got a Nobel Prize for figuring this out, okay? And I'm gonna tell you. And it seems so simple to you now, but they didn't have the ASAD curve the same way we do back then. Okay. So they say, no, the trade-off's only temporary. And they came up with the natural rate hypothesis that says, in the long run, we're always going to end up back at the natural rate, right? It's the natural rate of y, and of course that means the same as the natural rate of unemployment, right? Because unemployment and output are just opposites from each other, okay? So eventually, it doesn't matter what the inflation rate is, it doesn't matter how much price is going up or down, we're always going to end up back at yn, is what they said. Yes, but okay, so when this goes up, the prices go up instantly. So the price they get for their product goes up instantly. So now they're making output decisions. That's what this is. That's how they go from here to here. The movement from yn to the higher level of y is because their products, they're getting more money, nominal profit, right? But then the adjustment is once their wages catch up, they're going to go back to where they used to be, right? Imagine that you're the firm. Yes, profits all of a sudden go up nominally. And so you, boom, increase this y instantly, right? But then as your people you have to pay them more, you slowly end up going back to where you began at in the first place. And so it comes back to here. Okay? All right. So yes, so these guys came in and broke the party, right? Because this idea here was so Keynesian, right? They're like, that's fine. Just spend it. It's all good. It's okay, right? We'll have a high inflation rate, but we'll have really high output, so a low unemployment rate, right? The Keynesian people, remember that video I showed you the other day, right? The Keynesian people like just spend, party, limousines, and everything like that, like the video, right? But then these people show up, and guess what? Do you think people were super stoked with these guys? No, right? They're like, uh-oh, the party is going to end. because we're all going to come back to the long-run aggregate supply, right? And so they basically, remember the classical dichotomy. This is what I taught you guys. And the whole profession of economics for, I don't know, 30, 40 years forgot about this because they were all excited about the Keynesian stuff, right? They're like, oh, no, we're going to come back to the LRAS curve, okay? So basically, here's what it's going to look like, right? I'm just looking at the long run right now. I took off the short run aggregate supply. So here's my first AD curve. And then when the government just pumps it up, oh, by the way, this on the Phillips curve, we have this point. But when the government pumps up the AD curve and has higher prices, in the long run, we still are staying at YN, right? Yeah, stuff changes in the short run, but I'm going to forget about that. Just the long run. So guess what? In the long run, we're going to have high inflation, same rate of unemployment too. So the long run Phillips curve is actually straight up and down. They're like, guys, by pumping money into the economy, you're doing nothing but raising their inflation rate. You're doing nothing for unemployment in the long run, right? You're just creating these momentary, maybe 2 or 3 years like bumps in amount of the number of people working, but it's not fixing the long run unemployment problem, right? And to make problems even worse, right? Remember the SRAS curve moves when people change their expected inflation rate, right? When the firms go like, oh man, the inflation rate is going to be changed, right? So from 1961 to 1968, when they were pumping up this AD curve like this to get low unemployment, the people started catching on, right? And so they actually started moving their SRAS curve to the left, decreasing it long before 1968. But what was the government doing? They just kept pumping the AD curve up even more, and the SRAS curve was moving like this. So really, we're somewhere like up here on this graph, actually, right? They just kept pumping up the AD curve so much because people started changing their expected inflation, so the SRAS curve started shifting to the left long before 1968. But in order to, imagine we're like at this point. If we let the SRAS curve change, we would end up at the LRAS. Right? And so what the government was doing was super pumping a lot of money, a lot of spending in fiscal policy, and a lot of money into the monetary policy in order to pump this AD curve up so much. Inflation was starting to get a little bit out of control in 1968. Okay? All right. So in the 1960s, people said, oh, there's a one Phillips curve and it slopes downwards, right? And then Friedman and Phelps came along and they're like, the party's over actually, guys. At some point, we're going to come back to the same rate of unemployment that we've always had, except for all that extra money that you've pumped in the economy is just going to make the prices permanently higher now. Okay? And so how did we bring these two together? They came up with this idea that I've already technically taught you about, but here's the first people to come up with it. Expected inflation. They realized that these people have a separate SRAS curve for each expected inflation, right? Because they're expecting the prices to go up, which means they're expecting to have to pay their workers more, so they have to reduce their output, right? Short-run aggregate supply moves left, okay? So this was really difficult to think up without the kind of sophisticated ASAD model that I've taught you. This is really hard to come up with on their own, right? That's why they deserve Nobel Prizes for this. Okay, it's so simple and so true, but really hard to think up on your own. Okay, so they came up with this idea, expected inflation. And it fits into the SRAS curve. That's the explanation of how we get from this point to this point, basically. Right? That's what Milton Milton Friedman and Edmund Phelps were trying to figure out. How we got from this point to this point. What is it that changes? Well, it's the SRAS curve. Why does it change? Expected inflation. So they're the guys who invented this expected inflation thing. Okay? And so they said the inflation augmented Phillips curve, this is what they called it. It looks like this. The unemployment rate equals the natural rate of unemployment minus alpha times actual inflation minus the expected inflation. Okay. Erase. So technically, I've actually already taught you this before. You've seen something that looks very similar to this 2 chapters ago when I taught you the formula for the aggregate supply. Okay? Remember, it was these guys who came up with the short-run aggregate supply moving issue, right? And so just a reminder, the short-run aggregate supply equation says that the actual output y is equal to the natural rate of output plus some alpha times the price level minus the expected price level. Remember that? Okay? And so remember when the price level was more than what we expected, right? When the government pumps some more money into the economy and it catches people off guard and prices go up higher than they thought they would, right? This is a positive number times this. This is a positive number between 0 and 1, okay? Oh no, it can be between anything, actually. This is just a positive number. And so that means that our actual GDP is equal to the natural rate, where it should be, plus something. In other words, our actual GDP is higher when prices go up, right? That's the exact same thing we're talking about for unemployment, except for the opposite, right? Because when output goes up, unemployment goes down. So let's read this. The actual unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate of unemployment, where we're going to end up in the long run, minus alpha, same alpha, it's a positive number, times the actual inflation minus expected inflation, right? So if the government pumps a bunch of money into the economy, and it makes the inflation rate go up really high, and it surprises people, right, and catches them off guard, this is going to be a positive number, right? Because they only expected 2% inflation, and we got 3% inflation, for example. This is a positive number times this. This is a positive number, right? So our unemployment rate is going to be the natural rate of unemployment minus something. So that means our unemployment rate is going to be really low. Did everybody see that? Okay. It's the same exact thing that I've already taught you here. It's just this one was easier to teach you first. Okay? But it actually came from this guy, the long-run Phillips curve, or the inflation augmented, expected inflation augmented Phillips curve. It looks like this right here. Okay? So basically, in the short run, you can reduce the unemployment rate below the natural rate by making inflation greater than expected, right? So if you make inflation high, this number is positive. So you got natural rate of unemployment minus something. So unemployment's low, because it's maybe the natural rate, maybe 4 or 5%, minus something. So maybe you're at 1 or 2% unemployment. Right? But that only works for the short run, right? Because what ends up happening? If I give them a couple of years, guess what? I can't surprise them with actual inflation. They're going to change the expected inflation. They're going to learn, right? They're going to be like, yeah, of course. I know that it's going to be 4% next year because it was 4% last year. The Fed can't trick me twice, right? So they're going to expect 4%. This is going to be 0. This whole thing's going to be 0. So the unemployment rate is going to equal the natural rate of unemployment in the long run, right? Expectations catch up. Unemployment rate goes back to natural rate when inflation, no matter what inflation is. Okay, so I want you to imagine something here. We know that this is the truth now. They just barely figured this out in the end of the 60s, right? But in the beginning of the 60s, remember, 1961, 1962, 63, 64, all the way to 69, what's that, for like 9 years, 8, 9 years, the government, remember, they kept having, the graph, remember I showed you, it was like right here on the side, they kept having really low unemployment, right? For like 8 or 9 years. So what does that mean that they must have been doing, right? We had rates lower than the natural rate of unemployment for like 8 or 9 years. That means that actual inflation must have been higher than expected inflation for 8 or 9 years. Does that make sense? But people aren't stupid, right? So in 1961, maybe the inflation rate was 2%. And then the Fed injected some more money or something like that and made the inflation rate go up to 3%. Which made the unemployment rate go down. But then the next year, what are people going to guess for their expected inflation? 3% or 3.5%, right? They're going to expect that the Fed's going to do that, right? So in order to surprise them again, what does the Fed have to do? Make inflation even higher, like 4%, right? In order to trick them. And then each year, because they catch up like a year later. So this means that the Fed was having to do what? In order to keep surprising them, they had to make inflation really high. Even higher than it was the year before, right? So if it was 3%, then they had to make it 4% the next year, then they make it 5% the next year, right? They did this for like almost 10 years, 1961 and 1969, right? And unemployment was low, it was nice, but what were they end up doing? They were just pumping way too much money in, the Fed was. The government also was doing the same thing with the AD curve. They were doing government spending at the same time, but it started to get out of control, right? The second they stop pumping up the AD curve, what's going to happen? The SRS curve is going to come back, right? Expected inflation is going to catch up. They're going to go back to the natural rate of unemployment, and inflation rate is going to be like 10,000%, right? This is a bit of a problem. Okay, so now you guys see the issue. How does this expected inflation affect the Phillips curve graph? Well, we know how the expected inflation affects the SRIS curve. It moves the SRIS curve, right, to the left. Let's suppose that at the beginning, expected and actual inflation are 3%, which gives us the natural rate of unemployment 6%, right? So we have, these are the same. Nobody's surprised. Expected and actual is 3%, right? So according to this thing right here, if these are both 3%, this whole thing is 0, then unemployment is equal to natural rate, okay? And so we're here. In the short run, boom, I go ahead and pump up my AD curve and have some inflation, and I catch people off guard, right? I make inflation 5%, so it's 2% higher than expected. So I make inflation 5%, which means that my unemployment rate is going to fall, right? Yay, I'm on the short run Phillips curve. But what do I know is for sure going to happen in the long run? People are going to catch up, change their expected inflation. I know the SRIS curve is going to move back, and I know I'm going to come back to what percent of unemployment? 6%, right? So how does that happen in the Phillips curve graph? Easy. I just draw a new Phillips curve. It shifts it outwards. Okay, it shifts it outwards. In the long run, it's going to shift the Phillips curve out. People didn't, in the 1960s, they didn't realize that the Phillips curve itself could move, right? They thought that they could slide anywhere they wanted on this curve. They didn't understand the Phillips curve's moving itself also, right? And don't forget, see, this is inflation and this is unemployment rate. Anything in this direction is what? High unemployment and high inflation. This is bad territory up here. Look at what they're accidentally doing. They're pushing the PC curve, the Phillips curve, out here into the bad territory, the high inflation and the high unemployment rate. Anybody remember what it's called when I have high inflation and I have, high unemployment? Stagflation. This is that really bad place that we don't want to be in. They were accidentally creating stagflation here, right? And they're pushing the Phillips curve out, right? But it's because they didn't understand this whole idea about expected inflation, right? And so they're pushing the Phillips curve out. They thought they were just dancing up and down on one Phillips curve, right? And the data from the 60s looked like it, okay? To be honest, they weren't crazy. Remember the graph that I drew for you guys in the 60s? Looked kind of like this, right? But you know what's going to end up happening on this graph, on the data graph. I'll show you in a second. Right? In the 1960s, it looked kind of like this. But then what happens? You're going to start seeing some points move this way. If the ASAD model is right? Which it is. Okay? I wouldn't be teaching you something wrong, right? We know that the points, they were moving like this. Remember, they were moving like this? But the points are going to start coming out like this. Okay. Before we do that, though, let's have a little practice on the expected inflation curve. Okay. Natural rate of unemployment is 5%. Expected inflation is 2%. In the Phillips curve equation, alpha is 0.5. Okay. So go back a couple slides and get that Phillips curve equation. Here's what I want you to do. Give me a long run Phillips curve. This is really easy. Okay. Find the unemployment rate for each value of actual inflation. So you're going to take the Phillips curve equation and you're going to plug in 2% for expected. You're going to plug in 0.5 for alpha. And then you're going to plug in 0 for actual inflation. And you also plug in 6 for actual inflation. And then you're going to graph it for me. All right? You guys should have a place to graph it in your notes. Okay? Then change the expected inflation to 4%. And then repeat part B. Now, suppose the natural rate falls to 4%. Draw the new long run Phillips curve, and then do part B again. Okay? So basically, you're going to have two long run Phillips curves and 3 short run Phillips curves. All right, let's do A and B together. So this says the natural rate of unemployment is 5%, and we're going to go ahead and plot the long-run Phillips curve, which means that in the long run, the unemployment's always going to be at where? 5%. No matter what we do to the inflation, right? So the long-run Phillips curve is really easy, right? It's the unemployment's, where is it? It's at 5%, no matter what the level of inflation. Long-run Phillips curve. Okay. Oops. Now I want you to draw the short-run Phillips curve based upon the fact that people are expecting 2% inflation, right? And then I want you to see, okay, wait, what happens if we have 6% inflation, and what happens if we have 0% inflation? Or, yeah, if we have, 0% inflation is down here, and then what happens if we have 6% inflation? It's up here. So plug it into the formula for the short-run Phillips curve, which, don't forget, is something like, unemployment is equal to the natural rate of unemployment minus alpha times inflation minus expected inflation. Okay. Let's, did you guys get any points for the short-run Phillips curve? Let's look at the first point, okay? Let's do the the actual unemployment rate. Ren, what was the natural rate of unemployment? 5%, right? Minus, what was alpha? 0.5. What was, let's say that expected inflation is lower, and it's at 0%, okay? Say 0%, minus, what was expected inflation?
2.
What does this give us?
It's going to be 6.
Equals 6. Yep. So, this means that there's a point here when inflation is 0, the unemployment rate is 6. Okay? And so the graph goes through this point. There's this point right here you get, and this is the other graph, the other point you get. If inflation is 6%, you just plug 6 in here. You plug 6 in here. Okay, so you plug 6 in here when the inflation rate is 6%. 6 minus 2 is 4. 4 times 0.5 is 2. You get 5 minus 3 equals 2. Okay? So that's how we got this point right here, right? When inflation rate is, or I'm doing something wrong here. 5 minus 3, sorry. 6 minus 2 is 4. 4 times 0.5 is 2. 5 minus 2 is 3. Okay, so then when inflation is 6%, unemployment rate is 3%. So that's a short-run Phillips curve right there, right? The one that curves up and down. Okay, now what happens if we increase the expected inflation? Well, when I increase the expected inflation, it just shifts the Phillips curve to the right. Okay, the increase in expected inflation was just 1%, or 2%, excuse me. So it's going to move it to the right. Now finally, let's suppose that we change the natural rate of unemployment. It's just going to shift both of the curves to the left, right? I shifted the natural rate of unemployment from 5 to 4. This is something can only be done in the long run, right? Shifting the natural rate of unemployment, this is like a big deal. This is not like some short run government pumping money into the economy real quick sort of thing, right? This is maybe, I don't know, reducing some of the structural unemployment or the frictional unemployment or something like that, okay? You reduce the natural rate of unemployment to 4%, which means that in the long run the unemployment rate will always come back to 4%. And so when you do that, it shifts both the long-run Phillips curve and the short-run Phillips curve to the left by 1%. Okay? So that's kind of some ideas with how the Phillips curve works. Okay. So back to our story. The Keynesians versus the classical people, sort of, right? This is people coming up, Mr. Phillips, Samuelson, Bob Solow, and they're like, there's a Phillips curve. It's just straight up and down. This is great. Policy menu. You just choose whatever you want from the store, from the Fed, and then you can go ahead and have high inflation and low unemployment. This is great. Until what ends up happening? People start catching on, right? they change expected inflation, it increases, right? So when expected inflation increases, I know that my SRIS curve is going to move up like this, right? So I'm going to have higher price and lower output, higher employment, right? That means that even though it looks like I had this nice Phillips curve right here, I know that eventually my points are going to start moving in which direction? Out here, right? Because this is the higher unemployment and higher inflation region, right? I know that this is going to end up happening, right? So let's see what happens. In 1969, 70, 71, 72, 73. Look, exactly what we predicted would happen, right? It's called stagflation, right? We have this issue when the inflation rate is going up and unemployment rate is going up. Okay? So there's a Phillips curve here, and then what happens when expected inflation changes? It shifted to a new Phillips curve, right? You can almost see the new Phillips curve start to get traced out, right? Here was the old one, and here was the new one, just like that exercise we did just 1 second ago, right? Except in the exercise, I had a decrease in expected inflation, and so the Phillips curve shifted to the left. Increase in expected inflation shifts the Phillips curve to the right. Okay? And so you see we're on like a new Phillips curve right here for a little bit. Okay? And so you knew this was coming, they didn't. Because you know about the short run aggregate supply curve, they didn't really understand it yet. Okay? This is how everybody learned about it, was from this event right here. This is where we get this model from, all right? It's from these events, okay? It's kind of interesting. So Friedman and Phelps said, I told you, right? I told you people are changing their expected inflation. They're expecting more inflation because they watch the government and the Fed every year pump a bunch of money into the economy. They know inflation is going to happen, right? Eventually, unemployment is going to go back to the natural rate, okay? Eventually. Okay, so that's one thing that can shift the Phillips curve, is expected inflation. Because it shifts the SRIS curve, okay? What's another thing that could maybe shift the Phillips curve? Think of what's another thing that could shift the SRIS curve? Because every time the SRIS curve moves, that's what shifts the Phillips curve, right? What's something else that we've talked about in this class that could shift the SRIS curve? Yes, anything that affects supply. So what happens if we have a problem with oil, right? The price of oil goes up. That's what I always use for the thing that changes my supply curve, right? Because consumers, it doesn't change the AD curve. None of us buy crude oil. The people who buy crude oil are the firms. And so when the price of crude oil goes up, it gets more expensive for the firms to do business. They start doing less business. Boom. Short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, right? So let's do that. What happens if we have a supply shock? That's basically what I'm talking about, right? The supply curve is moving, okay? And this is any event, a supply curve is any event that changes the firm's costs, and so it shifts the aggregate supply curve, which will then shift the Phillips curve too. The Phillips curve curves. Okay? So remember, anything that's shifting the SRIS curve to the left, right? Higher expected inflation, higher oil prices, is going to make the Phillips curve shift out, right? So let me go back a little bit. Remember, we started shifting out in this direction. The Phillips curve does. Now we're on this new Phillips curve. Why did it shift out this direction? Because people started higher expected inflation, right? If the Phillips curve shifted out even farther, that would be even worse. Yes? Everybody in agreement with that? Yeah. Anybody know what happened in 1973? The oil price went up. There's the oil embargo, right? Well, what's that going to do? This was like a double whammy for these poor economists, right? They didn't even see this coming, and then two things happen all at once, right? The SRIS curve goes to the back, goes to the left because of higher expected inflation. The SRIS curve goes even farther back because 1973, the oil prices skyrocketed because there was an oil embargo, right? So what's that's going to do to the points here? It's going to shift them way out here eventually, right? So let's see how that happened. Okay, so we have this increase in oil prices. It happened in 1973. Okay, and how does it work? Well, basically just exactly like anything that shifts SRS curve, right? When the oil prices increase, what changes in the SAD model? Oil price goes up.
The supply.
Supply decreases, right? Me and you are the demanders. We don't buy crude oil. The only people who buy crude oil are firms, right? It moves the short run aggregate supply curve to the left. Okay, and so what does that mean? price goes up, and at the same time, output goes down, which means that what happens to unemployment here?
Fall.
Unemployment goes up, right? Because output is falling. Right? So we're making less stuff, which means more people are unemployed because there's not as many workers needed, right? Price is going up, unemployment's going up. This is that bad thing again, right? Because of stupid oil prices. So what's that going to do to the PC curve? It moves the whole curve out, just like that. Remember, in the Phillips curve, this area, going this direction is bad. Bad news bears, right? Because we got an increase in inflation, increase in unemployment all at the same time because of the oil price shock. This is really unfortunate for these poorer economists, right? Because they had this great thing going for 1961, 62, 63, 64, all the way to 1969. They had a nice Phillips curve. But then we saw on the previous graph in 1971, 1972, 1973, what ended up happening? The Phillips curve shifted out. And now, because of the oil price shift, it's going to shift out even more on these poor guys, right? Okay? So here was what the oil price looked like. Look, in January 1973, it was $3.56. Okay? 1974, it was $10.11, right? It's it's a year later. It went up like 3 times, right? Anybody remember why this happened? They all got together and raised prices. It was kind of sort of semi-political. But basically, this had nothing to do with the consumers in America or the firms in America. It was just people over there were raising the prices of oil on us, right? Okay? And so, remember, the Fed is in this world of, for 1961, 1962, 63, their solution to the high unemployment problem was pump up the AD curve, right? Okay. But this had been a problem because the SRAS curve had started falling because people were increasing their expected inflation. But what did they do? They just kept pumping up the AD curve. Well, when the oil shock hit, it made the SRAS curve move even farther to the left. So naturally, what's the government doing? They pump up the AD curve even more, right? So if you can imagine, where are we on this graph? SRAS curve is moving to the left. AD curve is moving this way. You can imagine where we are. We're like way up here. Inflation is super high. Unemployment is not being helped because we're always ending up back at the natural rate of unemployment, right? Okay. So basically, the only thing that was going on in 1973 was super high inflation, right? And then, unfortunately, every time the SRAS curve moved back, that means less output, means higher unemployment. So we were shifting Phillips curves into that bad zone, right? Well, the higher inflation made the Phillips curve shift even farther to the right. Okay? So it's kind of like this chain reaction, right? People started getting higher inflation, expecting higher inflation, and there was this oil shock. So then the Fed pumped in more money. So then people expected even more higher inflation in the future. Okay? So it's shifting the Phillips curve out into that stagflation area. Okay? Well, it just so happens that if you guys know your history, in 1979, there was another oil shock. This time, Iran there was an Iranian revolution, destabilized the area. Okay? Another oil shock. Man, these poor economists are not catching a break. It's like the perfect storm of bad stuff happening in the poor AS curve, right? So what happens in 1979? The prices start going up again. Check this out. Boom. They had doubled again in 2 years, okay, to $38 a barrel. Right? They were $3 a barrel for a big old barrel of oil, right? You've seen those barrels, right? Now it's like almost $40. So what's this doing? Severe shifts to the left in the AS curve, right? Okay? And so this is making the PC curve shift farther and farther to the right, okay? So look, remember the old PC curve used to be down here, right? And then as people's inflation started catching up, they got here and they got on a new PC curve. But then all of a sudden, all kinds of bad stuff started happening. 1973, oil shock. 1974, the Fed starts pumping in more money, but then people are expecting prices to go up anyway, so the Phillips curve shifts way over here, right? And then it starts kind of maybe coming back. But remember, originally we were way down here at the beginning, right, for the first Phillips curve. Now we're maybe forming this new Phillips curve here, but then Boom, 1979 hits again. And so what happens? Oil shock. So it shifts the PC curve out. So now we're back out here, right? So we've had at least three Phillips curves going on here. The original one that was down here from the 60s. Okay? This one in 1973. Then we have this one here in 1976, 77, 78, when people are starting to recover from the 1973 oil shock. But in 1979, the government run gets overthrown, and another oil shock happens. Boom, inflation and unemployment go up again, right? Stagflation. So these poor guys can't catch a break. So in 1981, man, we are in a bad state. Check this out. We got high inflation, and we got pretty high unemployment rate. And the whole thing in 1960, remember this whole story started in 1961, all they were trying to do was reduce the poor unemployment rate, right? They're like, we'll take a little inflation. But then stuff started spiraling out of control. 10% inflation per year almost. That is really, really, really high for the United States. Remember, originally we were down here with like 2%, 1% inflation, right? So prices are going up like crazy, okay? Prices are going up like crazy. And to a large extent, when people say like, oh, like sometimes you're older people, I remember when I was a kid, gum was 1 penny or something like that, right? There's been a lot of inflation since then. Most of the inflation happened right here, guys, in this couple of year period. You see how high we are in inflation? So the price of the gum stayed 1 cent for a long time. Then in the late 70s, early 80s, it jumped really quick, and then it's kind of stayed pretty flat. Okay. So when people talk about, oh, how stuff used to be so much cheaper back then, it's because of 1976, 77, 78, 79. It's because of that time right there. Okay. So what's going on here? By 1981, we're here. Something's got to happen, right? We've got to get rid of this inflation rate. It's way too high. Okay. So let me ask you. So we're at this point right here. So let's just remember. So the government was pumping up the AD curve, but then the SRS curve's falling. So we're at this place way up here. Okay, let me erase the other curves so we don't all get confused. Okay. By 1981, stuff's going bad. Let's suppose that we're somewhere here. You see we're really high level of price, really high inflation rate, right? Prices are really high. Inflation is clearly too high. We have to bring inflation down. Whose job is that? That's the Fed's job. Not a fun job. How are they going to do it? Look at this graph. What's the only way to bring inflation back down? What can the Fed control? The AD curve, right? And so what do they need? Which direction do they need to move the AD curve?
To the left.
To the left. Oh, this is a big problem. Because let's guess. Let's pretend that we're the Fed and we're going to reduce the AD curve, move it to the left. How does it do that? Well, remember, it takes money out of the economy and it sells the bonds back, right? So it sucks the money out of the economy. There's not very much money in the economy right now. This is a problem. Businesses, when they try to get loans, can they? No, because the interest rates are too high, right? Consumers, it's just really bad news, right? So they suck money out. Guess what? AD curve shifts down like this. Where are we at first? In the short run, we go here. This is a big problem because, yes, hey, that's nice. We did have prices go down a little bit. But guess what happened? Unemployment went up. Are people really happy about this situation right now? No. But they've got to do it, right? Because they let inflation get out of control by 1981. It was super, super high, right? So they're like, ugh, this sucks. Like, there's no other way to get this inflation to go down. Not according to this model, at least, right? And they sure didn't know any better way. No, that was wrong. They knew a lot. They were learning they're on the job training right here, right? As stuff is happening. And they're like, how do I get this inflation rate down? So we know that they have to decrease the AD curve. Now, the nice thing is that in the long run, if you're willing to wait for the long run, what do I know is going to happen? We're going to end up coming back to here. Because in the long run, the SRIS curve, people are going to see the lower prices, and then eventually they'll change their expected inflation. When they finally change their expected inflation, it will bring the SRIS curve down to here. And we'll be back at this point. We'll be happy again because we'll be at the natural rate of unemployment. The SRIS curve will here. But this is in the long run. It takes people a long time to adjust their level of inflation, their level of prices in their brain, right? Remember the 3 reasons why it takes a long time? Sticky prices, sticky wages, general confusion about what the heck's going on with the price level right now, right? Those are the 3 reasons. It takes them a long time to get there. So guess what? How are people really fans of the Fed right now at that point? They're like, what are you doing? You're destroying our economy, right? That's because people are only looking at the level of unemployment. They're not really thinking about the inflation rate, right? OK, so what is the cost of reducing the inflation? Well, when I have to reduce inflation, it's called disinflation. That's what's going on here. OK, by 1981, they're like, oh my goodness, we've got to reduce this level of inflation. OK, and so they must slow the rate of money growth or take money out of the economy. It reduces aggregate demand. It pushes aggregate demand down right here. Everybody hates the Fed during this time, right?
Oh, do we have a recession right now?
You'll see. You'll see. I don't want to give away. It's like an awesome story. It's just unfolding. It's like a book. It's like a movie right here, and you're learning economics at the same time. I think it's very interesting what happened. Okay. I mean, hopefully you can predict the end because you know what it looks like in the long run. Okay? So this is going to happen, right? Okay. In the long run, though, right, the SRIS curve is going to come back forward again. Once everybody realizes that this disinflation thing is real, people start lowering their expected inflation. The long-run SRIS curve comes forward, increases, and then we come back to YN. Oh, and the nice thing is we're at a way permanently lower level of P, right? So when people start getting a clue and moving the SRIS curve forward, when the factories do, it actually makes our price come down even more. It helps the disinflation even more. It helps bring our prices down. Okay? All right. So what happens? Well, contractionary monetary policy. That's where they take money out, right? That's where they move the AD curve. That's what contractionary monetary policy does. Moves the AD curve to the left. Okay? It moves the economy from A to B. Okay? This is in the short run. Okay? What happens to the unemployment rate? It goes up. It goes up a lot. Right? Inflation comes down a little bit. That's nice. But everybody hates the Fed because they just made the unemployment rate go up. But then in the long run, what happens? The SRIS curve comes down, and we end up coming back to YN, which means we're going to come back to the natural rate of unemployment. How does that happen? Shifts downwards. The PC curve shifts downwards, right? And this is good. Because remember, on the PC, on the Phillips curve, this area is bad. Going back towards this area is much better, right? So it's like, they call it belt tightening, right? Belt tightening. It like squeezes the economy back down. It sucks for a couple years, but once the long run shows up, then it's OK, right? Once the long run shows up, we move the Phillips curve back down here. This is actually where we want to be. Okay. This is like, going to the gym and running on the treadmill for a long time. Then you're all sore and it's horrible, but then in the long run, you're actually happier that you went to the gym and ran on the treadmill, right? This is the version of it for our country, right? This is going and exercising, right? They're cutting down the level of inflation, which it hurts in the short run, but then in the long run, it goes back to the natural rate. Okay? All right. So you have to just deal with this. You have to deal with this time here at this point when you have really low output and high inflation. In order to get back to low inflation, you have to deal with the point of high unemployment. Sorry, not inflation, high unemployment. Okay? And so they call this the sacrifice ratio, right? It's like in order to get from here to there, how much unemployment do I have to give up? Or how much output do I have to give up, right? So the typical estimate right now for the sacrifice ratio is 5, which means that if I want to reduce inflation rate 1%, right? If I want to pull the AD curve down so that the inflation rate comes down 1%, how much of my Y am I going to miss out on? I'm going to miss out on 5% of my Y. Just in the short run, of course. But, I mean, that's a big deal, right? People are not happy. I mean, that's huge. This is one of the big reasons why inflation is really hard to get out of control, get under control. Once you make inflation go up to 10%, every time you want to bring down inflation 1%, you have to give up 5% of all of the goods that you make in the United States. Imagine that. Everybody in the country, our income is going to go down 5% for that 1 year or 2 years. That's like really hard, right? It's a big deal. That's very difficult. Okay? Now you can spread the cost over time. So let's say that in 1981 it was 10% and they needed to bring it down to 4%. So they had to take it down by 6% total, right? They have a couple of plans, right? You could just give up 30% of your GDP in 1 year and be done with it in 1 year. But I mean, who's going to go for that? That means if I make, $30,000, then next year I'm only going to make $20,000. No, that's going to make a lot of people homeless or something. That's really bad. So what you do, you spread it out over a couple of years. So maybe you can give up 10% and then 10% and then 10% of your GDP for 3 years in order to bring the inflation down, right? So this is like something to think about for those Keynesians out there, right? We're all about pushing up the AD curve, and we're like, it's okay, price level goes up. But man, if we want to pull the price level back down, we have to give up a lot, right? It destroys our GDP for a couple of years. It destroys our unemployment rate for a couple of years, okay? And so somebody came up with an idea. They called it rational expectations. And basically is people are not as crazy as we think. Remember that the only thing that changes from the SRIS to the long run, or this is not the long, this is confusing. This is the short run SRIS, but it takes, you have to wait for the long run. And then this SRIS happens. What's the thing that changes from this SRIS to this SRIS? Just people expect inflation to decrease, right? That's the only thing that changes from this SRIS to this SRIS. People expect inflation to decrease. So guess what? If you could just go out and walk to tell every single firm owner, hey, I promise you inflation's going to go down. I promise you inflation's going to go down. I promise you inflation's going to go down, right? If you could just convince everybody really quickly, guess what would happen? This SRIS curve would fall down quickly. The long run would only take a day or two to get to, right? If you could just somehow go out and convince everybody that is really going to happen, right? It could go down instantly. Because the only thing that we wait for the long run is because sticky prices, sticky wages, general confusion about what's going on. It just takes a long time for the SRIS curve to come back down, right? To come to the right, right? And so Robert Lucas, Thomas Sargent, Robert Barrow said, yes, it takes a long time for people to change their expected inflation, but they're rational. If we can just convince them that it's really going to happen, then it'll go quickly, right? So they're like, oh, it's fine. Because we might be down here at this point for a day, but then if we can convince everyone that the prices are really going to keep going down, they're going to move their SRIS curve to the right, and it will bring us back to the long run equilibrium in like a day. That's kind of what their idea was, right? And so basically what the Fed has to do is convince everybody that they really are going to reduce inflation. And guess what? People have to trust the Fed that they're not lying, right? Because the Fed if the Fed convinced everybody, oh, we're going to have really low inflation, and you guys all took it, and then the Fed's like, ooh, wait, they're all believing me. If I just real quick raise inflation real quick, unemployment will go down, and then I'll look like a hero, right? So the Fed kind of has the incentive to sort of cheat, right? So are you guys going to listen to the Fed? You are the firm owners? I don't know. But if they do, right, if the Fed can convince everyone that, yes, I'm really going to bring down the inflation, so you can go ahead and move your SRIS curve just right now. You don't have to wait 2 years, right? Just do it now, right? If they do that, then expected inflation falls. Everybody believes the Fed. They expect lower inflation. the SRIS curve comes to the right, and the PC curve shifts down, right? Which is good for the PC curve, for the Phillips curve, right? Okay. So the idea here is if the Fed can convince people, then we don't have to spend that long in low output. We don't actually have to give up all of that output, right? But the Fed has to be trustworthy. People have to believe the Fed. Okay. We know that by 1981, the inflation rate is too high, right? And something has to be done about it. The only thing that can be done about it is to decrease the AD curve. Big problem. When I decrease the AD curve, I also decrease output, which makes unemployment go up. People aren't quite happy. Some people thought of something, though. They're like, no, if we can just convince people that inflation is going to go down, then they'll move the SRAS curve quickly. And we'll get to the long run in just like, a couple days instead of a couple years, right? But just kind of think about the enormity of that task. Basically, here's what the idea for rational expectations is saying. We have to trust the Fed so much that you and I, when we go get a job next year, we're like, yeah, I know I'm being paid $50,000 this year, but I trust the Fed. I trust the prices are coming down. So I'm going to go get my next job and only get paid $45,000 next year, right? Like, I don't know. Probably most people don't trust the Fed that much, that they're going to go ahead and take a price cut to know that, oh, yeah, the Fed's going to bring down prices. So I'm not going to feel like I'm actually losing any money because the Fed told me they were taking prices down, right? But, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and believe the Fed so much that I'm going to take a price cut. But it's not going to feel bad because I'm going to get the same amount of real wage because all the prices are coming down because I trust the Fed, right? That's the idea behind rational expectations. If that were true, which probably is not, if that were true, though, the SRAS curve would come down instantly, right? There would be no sticky wages, The reason why wages are sticky is because people are like, no, heck no, I'm not changing my wage because I'm worried. Like, you bring down the prices first, you let me see it for a couple of year or two or something, and then I'll go ahead and take a lower pay cut, right? That's why the long run takes 2-3 years to get to, right? I mean, that's exactly what the deal is, right? If they can just convince people instantly, though, the SRAS curve would come down and we wouldn't be in this bad spot for that long, okay? Well, did that happen, right? 1981, we have to bring down inflation. It's like 10%. So they bring in this guy, Paul Volcker. He becomes the chairman of the Fed, right? He's got the job that no one wants, right? He was appointed in 1979, and they gave him the Fed, and they're like, oh, by the way, we kind of ruined the country here. We have super high inflation, and we have super high unemployment. So go ahead. go for it, right? This is the job no one wants. This guy kind of became sort of famous because he had the job that no one really wanted, right? Because what does he have to do? What is his job right now? It's to bring the AD curve down, right? Which is going to bring us from this point to this point. We already have high unemployment, so when he brings the AD curve down, output's going to fall. That's going to make the unemployment problem even worse, right? Okay? So he's like, okay, I'm going to change the Fed policy to disinflation, right? We're going to take money out of the economy. Okay, so from 1981 to 1984, he comes in 1979. He just tries to get everything in place in 1980, and by 1981, he's on it. Okay? Oh, by the way, there's one other problem, because don't forget that for many years, the government had been pumping the AD curve up. I had this before. Both fiscal and monetary policy were pumping the AD curve up, right? Paul Volcker came into the role for the Federal Reserve, so he could decrease monetary policy, but he had nothing to do with fiscal policy, right? He couldn't convince the government to stop spending money, right? So the problem is the government was still spending money, so he had to overcome the federal government also, because the federal government was still trying to spend money to pump up the AD curve. And he's like, no, I got to bring down the AD curve. So he had to take out money, not only just to move the AD curve, but also to overcome the extra government spending that the government was doing, right? He had to pull out so much money that the AD curve would move down, even though the government was still trying to pump up the AD curve, right? So he had the job for sure nobody wanted. The Fed policy had to be extremely contractionary to suck out enough money to get that AD curve fall down, even when the federal government was still trying to pump it up. Okay? It's a very weird time, right? So, by the end of this time, by the end of 1984, inflation fell to 4%. All right? But guess how those couple of years were? Right? Yeah. They probably weren't great years. Why? Because output falls. All right, so let's look at it. So he becomes chairman in 1979. Stuff's getting out of control. By the time he gets here, he decides in 1981, contractionary monetary policy. Suck all the money out. Boo! Right here. Boom. Right? You can see this is a short-run Phillips curve. But this short-run Phillips curve is way the heck out here, right? Remember the original one in the 1960s was way down here, right? They got way out of control. This is a short-run Phillips curve, right? He slides along the short-run Phillips curve. But look, man, unemployment is out of control, 10%. This is as bad as it was during the housing market burst, right? The housing market burst. And this is a bummer because there was no housing market burst. This is because one guy was asked to reduce, not one guy. Everybody in the economy was asked to reduce inflation. But it was all under the watch of Paul Volcker, right? He had the job no one wanted. He makes unemployment go crazy. But stuff starts catching back up. We start coming back to the long-run equilibrium, right? So there was super high unemployment, but we know as we get to the long run, it will end up coming back, right? We'll be okay. But he was able to reduce unemployment to like 4%. So he did a good job. I mean, this is why he's kind of famous. It was a job no one wanted, and he said, okay, I'll do it. And then he did it, right? But people were not really happy with an unemployment rate near 10%. Think of that. 1 in 10 people that want to work out of work, right? We haven't seen levels that high in a long time. Even when the housing market burst, we were hardly at 10%. Okay? So that was Paul Volcker. And then after him, Alan Greenspan became the chairman of the Fed. Oil prices fall 50% in 1986. Okay? 1989 to 1990, unemployment fell, inflation rose. The Fed raised interest rates, caused a mild recession there. How does the Fed raise interest rates? They suck money out of the economy and they move the AD curve to the left. Okay? This is just kind of completing the story that I started telling you from the 1960s. All the interesting stuff is pretty much done, right? All the drama about AS and AD curve moving. Now we're just kind of on to just regular finishing the story. In the 1990s, unemployment and inflation fell. So this is really interesting too, because in the 1990s, we have inflation going down, and at the same time we have Y going up. So what must be happening, right? We must have the SRS curve coming forward as well as the AD curve going back, right? And 2001, anybody remember what happened in 2001? This was the first bubble that I was old enough to really see it happen and see it coming, right? 2001 tech market bubble. Same thing as the housing bubble pretty much, but people were buying technology stocks. Over-leveraging, taking out too much money, buying stocks, pushing the price of stocks up, and then the bubble popped, right? So when the bubble popped in 2001, what happened? AD curve shifted to the left. It created the first recession in a decade. So what did policymakers do? They're not going to wait for the long run. What do they do? Pump up the AD curve. That happened in 2001. Okay. So in the Greenspan era, here's basically what the curve looks like. Basically, it just hovers around 1 point. 1990, 92, 94, 96, 98, 2000, 2002. Right? So we have pretty stable inflation and unemployment. Just from gentle moves of the AD curve during this time, just to keep everything in line. So you can kind of see the natural rate of unemployment for the United States, probably somewhere just over 5%. You just kind of see that. It's just kind of hovering right around there. That was Alan Greenspan.
Where are we now?
What's that?
Where are we now?
Where are we now? Well, that's a good question. We'll get to, I think, 2010 on this. I'll show you. Okay. So Ben Bernanke. He was the chair of the Fed after Alan Greenspan. He took office in 2006, and he had held office until 2014. So he had, guess what happened right about 2006? Housing bubble's at its top, right? So he comes into office, and then, I don't know, a year later, the housing market pops. And so basically, his entire term was dealing with the housing market, right? So the housing market boom turned to bust in 2006. This was the next bubble to pop after the tech bubble. So household wealth fell, millions of mortgage defaults, heavy losses at financial institutions. We've talked about this, the housing bubble, like every single week in this class because I think it's very important. And then the associated recession that happened in 2008, 2009. And so the AD curve moved to the left, right? The AD curve moved to the left great way. What did the government do? What did Ben Bernanke do? They started pushing up the AD curve. We know that. We all lived through probably one of the biggest responses of any government to any recession ever. We all lived through it, just this one right here, right? The government tried to push the AD curve up in America harder than in any other place probably in the entire world ever. They dropped taxes. They increased spending. The Fed put so much money into the market that the overnight rate between banks was 0%. There was so much money out there. People were giving each other money for free, right? So there was a huge response pushing the AD curve back up. That was under Ben Bernanke. Okay. So here's where we are, kind of now. When the AD curve falls, what happens? Prices fall and unemployment goes up. So we were at 2006, we were doing good, right? AD curve falls. What happened? Prices fall, the inflation rate goes down, unemployment goes up. That's exactly what happened here, right? Just like we would predict. Okay, just like we would predict. This, hey, it's a new Phillips curve. If you see this little spot right here, it's tracing out another new Phillips curve. You see that? And then we go ahead and pump a lot of money into the economy and pump a lot of government spending into the economy and see inflation started slowly rising here in 2012, right? Up to 2010, 2011, 2012. You see the economy is doing its natural correction back to the natural rate of unemployment, right? It'll get there eventually. It'll just take a couple of years. How come the inflation rate was not higher even though there was a huge response? It's because the demand curve shifted so low. The aggregate demand curve shifted so far to the left that even though they tried to push it up a bunch, they still weren't able to push it up that much. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. All right. So 2010, 2011, 2012, slow recovery. It reduces unemployment and increases inflation. As the AD comes back, the price level starts coming back a little bit. That's why our prices are going back up. Okay. Basically, this happened quick enough that maybe expectations of inflation didn't really change that much. So the original Phillips curve is pretty much the same. So you see we fell along this Phillips curve. We're kind of almost going back to the long run, along the same Phillips curve almost. All right, so conclusion. The ideas in this chapter come from the smartest guys in economics in the 1900s, right? Friedman, Phelps, Robert Solow, Lucas, Milton Friedman. This chapter is really cool. I think it's the story of what we learned in economics and macroeconomics in America in the 1900s, specifically from 1950 to 2000, right? That's where this stuff comes from. This doesn't come out of thin air. People are like, oh, the economy's doing that right now. I need to try to explain it. And so we came up with these models, right? The ASAD model, the inflation augmented Phillips curve, okay? So inflation and unemployment. In the long run, they have nothing to do with each other, right? Because of the classical dichotomy. Inflation, nominal variable. Unemployment, real variable. Totally unrelated. We know that in the long run, we're always going to come back to the natural rate no matter what price does, right? But in the short run, they definitely go together. right? Ask Paul Volcker. He had that awesome task of ruining our economy for 4 years while he tried to get inflation under control, right? He figured it out. So negative related in the short run. And also, it all comes down to what we expect inflation to be, right? Expectations are what moves our economy from the short run to the long run. You know, you want to say, how long does it take our economy to get from the short run to the long run? It's until everybody starts believing that the inflation rate is going to be what it is, right? And so if the Fed could just go around and convince everybody in one night, you know, oh, by tomorrow we're going to change inflation, so you all need to get new wage contracts that are lower, then the inflation thing could be over tomorrow, right? The disinflation could have been over in one day. But, yeah. So, whoops. That's the conclusion of this chapter. That is the conclusion of all the things you're going to actually learn in this class. So, hopefully you guys thought this stuff was kind of fun and interesting. I like the class. I kind of teach it. I think it's like more of like a history of the United States class, class also, right? Because it's boring just to learn all of the theories and the graphs without knowing the history to me, right? So you kind of teach like a history class. You learn about why we do what we do.